Should Big Cat Leonard Williams be considered to win Defensive Player of the Year for 2024? What's going on, people? It is Friday. It is Friday morning, an unconventional Friday morning for us. The Seahawks got the win last night, so it is Victory Friday. It's not a conventional Victory Friday. Admittedly, you very rarely win a game where you score 6 points, but that's what the Seahawks did last night. And it's a good opportunity as any to talk about their best player on defense. And that has been this year, I think, pretty clearly. I don't know if anybody's going to disagree with me on this one. Big Cat Leonard Williams. And obviously, the play that he has put on the field this year, I think it's very clearly worthy of a Pro Bowl berth. And I think it's very clearly worthy of an All-Pro nod. But here's the thing we're going to try to figure out in this video. Could it be so good that it's worthy of Defensive Player of the Year? Could Leonard Williams do something that hasn't been done in Seattle in over 3 decades and take home Defensive Player of the Year? Let's talk about it a little bit. Before I get into this, though, I hope you like this video. If you do, please click the thumbs up button down below. Subscribe if you are new. Click the bell for notifications. Become a channel member for $2 a month. Those are the best ways to help support the channel. So it feels like a good time to talk about this because Leonard Williams, after last night, is now the tied for leading sack artist in the entire NFL for somebody that plays a majority of their snaps as a interior defensive lineman. And I did check on Pro Football Focus. He does play a majority of his snaps in B-gap. He does play a lot over tackle because, you know, we kind of sort of do this 3-4 stuff, but kind of sort of not really. He does line up outside occasionally, but on average less than 10 times a game. And he lines up in A-gap once or twice a game on average. So he is primarily an inside defensive lineman. He plays on the interior. So 9 sacks is remarkable, and there's only one player that plays predominantly on the inside that has as many sacks as he does. And it's Dexter Lawrence, who is out for the season. So in all likelihood, if Leonard Williams gets one more sack or even a half a sack in his final game next week, he's the leader. And it's not just that. It's not just the sacks. It's also the plays he's making against the run. I believe ESPN actually separates out tackles for loss from sacks, which I wish more sites would do. But according to ESPN, they have him at 9.5 stuffs, which is a tackle for loss. So if that's accurate, that means he's also making plays against the run. He's got around 60 tackles on the season overall, so he is making plays in that area as well, about as much as he typically does in a full season. And let's not forget the interception, which, look, the interception he had against the Jets was a very fun play, and it's a very interesting trivia question now. What is the longest defensive lineman return touchdown in NFL history? But it was also a massive play that completely swung that game in favor of the Seahawks and got them to the point where they could actually win that game. So it's not just fun. It's actually something that was important. So with that being said, could it be enough to win Defensive Player of the Year? Because as we've already established, I believe that it should be enough to get him on the Pro Bowl and almost certainly first team All-Pro if you consider him to be a defensive tackle. So in order to determine this, you got to look at the guys that the NFL likes to give this award to. You've got Myles Garrett last year, Nick Bosa the year before that, TJ Watt. You've got Khalil Mack. You've got Terrell Suggs. You've got James Harrison. You've got Jason Taylor. Over the last 20 years, they frequently give it to a guy who is a sack wizard, a superstar edge rusher. somebody who leads or almost leads the league in sacks. And if they don't do that, what you will also frequently see is them give it to an interior defensive lineman that is getting pressure stats and sack stats like he's an edge rusher. Aaron Donald 3 times, J.J. Watt 3 times. Those two guys alone defined the ability of the interior rusher to still be rewarded. And those two things encompass most of this. You have Stephon Gilmore, cornerback. He won it in 2019. You have an off-ball linebacker like a Luke Kuechly or a Brian Urlacher who got it. You have Charles Woodson, Troy Polamalu, Bob Sanders, Ed Reed. You do have the occasional defensive back who wins it, but especially recently, the league has been leaning towards giving Defensive Player of the Year to whoever is generating quarterback pressure the best. So the general formula is there. And I will say this does not feel like a year where there is an obvious Defensive Player of the Year candidate. It doesn't. To me, this feels like a year where there are a handful of guys playing at a really high level, but nobody is going to that next level where it's just so obviously theirs. Like, you take a look at the league sorted by sacks. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here. Okay, there we go. That's a little bit better. Right now, the league leading sacker is Trey Hendrickson. 13.5 sacks. That's really not all that. That's really not that great. Like, we see sack artists in the modern NFL get up to 18 plus. And Trey Hendrickson does have 2 more games left. Maybe he'll make it up. Maybe he'll get up to 15, 16. But in all likelihood, there's not going to be some guy pushing 20 sacks this year. And he's the leader by a good amount. Second place is a tie. You've got Danielle Hunter of Houston, who has 1 game left, and Myles Garrett of Cleveland, who has 2 games left at 12. So there is a very realistic chance that the league leader in sacks in 2024 will have 15 or fewer sacks, which you would typically expect more. You wouldn't typically expect such a low number of sacks to be the league leader. So it's not a typical year where the NFL can just shrug their shoulders and say, hey, give it to TJ Watt because he got 19 sacks this year. Give it to Myles Garrett because he got 18.5 sacks this year. There's a little more nuance here. There's a little more stuff you got to pull through to get to the bottom of this. So they're not necessarily going to just give it to whoever has the most sacks because that person isn't putting themselves forward with the authority that you would typically be looking for. So you go over to the leading tacklers in the NFL. If you sort by total tackles, there's really not a lot here that stands out to me in some super strong way, right? Like, we've got, first of all, a good chunk of guys that aren't going to make the playoffs, and we'll come back to that at the end of this video. But I certainly don't think of most of these guys as being Defensive Player of the Year candidates. Budda Baker's very good, but I don't get the sense anybody's thinking about him in those terms. Roquan Smith is very good, but is he a Defensive Player of the Year good? I don't think so. I like Zach Bond a lot. He's great. He's a lot of fun, but I don't think he's getting that kind of attention. So I don't think you're going to see that kind of player come from here personally. And you go sort by, say, interceptions, because again, we're looking for the easy way out for the NFL. The NFL, in certain circumstances, could just say, hey, give it to that guy because he has the most X or the most Y or the most Z. Well, you sort by interceptions, you got 2 guys with 7 interceptions, which is good, obviously. You got Xavier McKinney of Green Bay, Kirby Joseph of Detroit. So maybe they get to 8 by the end of the season, but I don't know if 8 interceptions is getting you a free Defensive Player of the Year. It's like, it's a good number, but I think Richard Sherman had 8 interceptions in back-to-back seasons for the Legion of Boom, and he was never even really considered for Defensive Player of the Year to my knowledge. We see players do that semi-frequently, honestly. Not as much as we used to, but it happens often enough to where it's not mind-blowing. Nobody here has 12 interceptions. Something like that, you might just waltz your way to a DPOTY, but we're not seeing that here. So it's open, is what I'm trying to get at here. There's not some obvious candidate who's just going to show up and everybody's going to vote for him without even really thinking about it. It doesn't feel like it's the kind of year where you can just show up to the party and be handed DPTOTY because, hey, look at this stat. Like, this stat is so good, you have to give it to me. So that does open up the door for Leonard Williams. I mean, if you go back to sorting by sacks, by the way, if he gets a sack next week, then there's a chance he ends up in the top 10 overall for sacks on the season. So here's the question. With all this being said, who are the defensive player of the year candidates? Sorry, I keep defaulting to rookie in my mouth. But yeah, defensive player of the year. Who are going to be the real candidates? Well, here's the problem. And this is why I think that it's somewhat unlikely that Leonard Williams will be a serious candidate. He might be a candidate, but if we're talking about him winning, most of these players were on teams that made the playoffs, and most of them were also part of very good defenses, or at the very least, I'd say solid defenses. And the Seahawks, I mean, they do have a solid defense. Right now, they're ranked top 10 in the league in points allowed. It is a good defense. But as of right now, it is statistically unlikely to be a playoff team. Like, you look at the Browns last year, the Niners the year before, Steelers, Rams, Patriots, Rams. You have to go back a little ways to find somebody who won this award without making the postseason. Obviously, Cortez Kennedy did it many years ago, but Big Cat's not Cortez. And that's no disrespect to him. He's not Cortez. He's not Tez Kennedy. Sometimes you're just not that good. You're just not quite up there yet. So he's going to have to try to overcome that. Now, it will be easier for him to overcome that than most other players. If the Seahawks win next week, they will have 10 wins. And I think that some voters could look at that and say, hey, that's a 10-win team. Who cares if they didn't make the playoffs? They got unlucky. We'll treat them like we would any other 10-win team, right? The Browns were not much better than that last year. They just happened to make the playoffs because their circumstance allowed it, right? I think that the Rams in 2020 won, it was either 10 or 11 games, and I think it was 10. So Aaron Donald won Defensive Player of the Year there, so they could potentially look at things like that. They could. It will not terribly surprise me. But I'm taking a look at these other players. Let's go back to the sack list here. You've got a guy like Van Ginkel, who has 11 sacks and 2 pick sixes. You've got a guy like Nick Bonito, who has 11.5 sacks and a pick six on national TV. You've got, you could still give it to, probably not Hendrickson, because he's not going to make the playoffs and his defense is a train wreck. You could give it to Danielle Hunter, I guess, especially if he does something in his final game. He is running out of time. There are some candidates here that lend themselves to an easy Defensive Player of the Year award, if not obvious, right? Like, you wouldn't feel bad about giving it to any of these guys. And looking at this list, admittedly, maybe Roquan Smith could be under consideration. His team is going to be in the playoffs, but Ravens defense, not all that great. So I don't think there's much here. What I would say is we probably need to go beyond the obvious counting stats, as we often need to do in the NFL. So somebody like a Patrick Surtain, who's been really, really good this year, but he doesn't have massive interception numbers because most teams know not to target him. To my knowledge, the best any receiver has done when singled up on Surtain this year is DK Metcalf, and DK Metcalf didn't even have 40 yards on him. So he's been shutting it down. Maybe they give it to him. Denver has one of the best defenses in the league. They're probably going to make the playoffs. Could go to him. And like I said, Bonito could be another guy on that team. Maybe they end up splitting the vote from each other. I don't know, but I feel like there's something here that would keep it away from Leonard Williams, even if he does very well next week against the Rams. I just think that there is enough for them to not give it to somebody who probably will not play in the postseason. But that doesn't mean he doesn't deserve it. Don't get me wrong. And I do think that he very much does deserve it. He's played phenomenal football. He's done everything you could ever ask a defensive lineman to do, probably more. Because again, that pick six is not just a funny play. It's not just a cool play. It is a play that saved us from what was going to be an embarrassing loss against the Jets. So that is one of the most impactful plays of the year for this team. That's certainly more of a punch than somebody like Van Ginkel, who got a pick six at the end of a game that the Vikings were already going to win back in week 1. But I just think there's going to be enough for somebody else to get over the hump. And maybe it won't be a guy like Van Ginkel because he's not a huge name, even though his performance this year is pretty impeccable overall. The impact he's had is insane. I feel like they're going to give it to somebody like Surtain. I feel like Surtain's going to get it. And I can't say there's anything bad about that. He's been great. He's been anchoring an elite defense, which I can't even say that for Big Cat, right? He's been anchoring a good defense on the whole this year, but it's not as good as Denver's. And Denver is almost certainly making the playoffs. And you cannot say that about the Seahawks. So that would be my guess. But Williams should be on the list. I think that, especially if he gets that 10th sack next week, gets to double digits, maybe even gets up into the top 10 for all players in the NFL for sacks, as a guy who plays a majority of his snaps on the inside, you got to at least mention him. He's got to at least make the short list. All right, I'm going to get out of here. Plenty more to say later today, but I thought that would be the best way to open the day after yesterday's really good defensive performance. And it's very easy to get caught up in how bad the offense looked yesterday, and we'll do some of that too, but don't let it be forgotten that this defense, I mean, the Bears haven't played that bad in every other game they played this year. That's for sure. They haven't looked that bad except for maybe the Patriots game. Maybe. All right. Go Hawks. See you guys later.